Koinant, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And this is another huge shout out to Fiona, the lady who writes these amazing articles about her life in South Africa and about what she experienced. And she's sent me another article which is called Working and Living with Zulus. I'm going to preface this piece with a comment about Africans in general, but Zulus in particular. I've had a lot of questions on the forum as to whether South African blacks know their own history. They don't know their own history or traditions and customs. Neither do they display the respect and good manners that even we white children on the farm had to adhere to or get a scolding, and even a gentle slap on the back of the legs if we didn't obey. Simple things like how to shake hands properly, not the strange double and sometimes triple ghetto handshake the Africans do now, which always takes me by surprise. We had to bend our knees slightly, offer our right hand with the left hand clasping our right elbow to show it wasn't holding a weapon, and keep our head bowed, not looking the adult in the eye, which is seen as a challenge. Accepting anything, including gifts, also had to be a certain way, and I can provide more examples later. None of the current black South Africans have a clue about this, particularly the younger ones. I suspect the only history books that the older blacks have read are those heavily biased, slanted, propagandist, leftist books written by ignorant white liberals and black academics with an agenda, including Mandela's autobiography. The rest of the propaganda they sprout, they have created themselves. Sadly, with literacy having reached the zenith and now on the decline due to the general dumbing down of education at schools and universities, there will be more and more black South Africans who are illiterate, particularly at the rate that they are giving birth to babies, thanks to the ANC policy of generous grants to all mothers who produce more children. The schools are failing, and electricity is so unreliable now that there will be no better way that African children can learn any form of literacy or computer skills and better themselves. Even pre-1994, from the word go, the ANC said that the blacks must outbreed the whites so that they could take over the country, and hence are rewarding them for having more and more babies, but without providing the resources either to feed them and certainly not to educate them. Even little girls at the age of 12 are now seen queuing up at the Department of Home Affairs, newborn infants tied onto their backs, waiting to receive their money. Other very young mothers from 15 years old and up not only have newborns, but one or two even have toddlers with them. I've received report from family members who have been eyewitness to this horror. The question is, who are the fathers? I imagine that either their fathers, single mothers' boyfriends, or practically any male could rape these children in order to make money. Nor do I think the money the mothers receives all goes towards buying baby food and other necessities. I don't think I'm far wrong for the following reason. There is the other particularly appalling practice which has happened in the townships and squatter camps relatively recently, now that the traditional rural customs have been abandoned, and of which I was first-hand experience with my own domestic worker. If a Zulu man is looking for a wife, before he pays out expensive lobola, he needs to know that she's not barren, so he has sex with her to make sure she can bear children. When I lived in Hilton, in what was then the Natal Midlands, from 1987 to 1994, I had a sweet-natured and very pretty 20-year-old housemaid called Margaret. She was my nanny's granddaughter, and her mother worked for my parents on the farm as their cook. I took her on as she couldn't speak a word of English and couldn't get work anywhere else. Because I speak fluent Zulu and I knew and liked her, I gladly gave her a live-in job, and we had a warm and very cordial relationship. During the 7 years we lived together, she gave birth to no fewer than 3 babies. When I asked her in Zulu who the fathers were, she had no idea, other than that they were all different men. Eventually, I drove her to the local clinic to get a 3-monthly contraceptive injection, as she treated them with suspicion and couldn't be relied upon to take the daily pill, and there were no more babies after that. She said, "They just come to my room. I had servants' quarters in the grounds, bang on the door to be let in, and then they demand to have sex with me." I'd sent her back to Impengele, where her family came from before she gave birth each time, and gave her a month's paid maternity leave, after which she'd leave the new baby with her aunt and then come back to her job with me. This was her choice, as she loved her job, was treated with respect, and given a generous salary and plenty of handouts of food and clothing to take back home every other weekend. With the second baby, she had misjudged her dates, as she couldn't count, and almost gave birth in the back of our car as we raced her to Edendale Hospital in the middle of the night. We got her there in the nick of time, and Sponiswa was born in the corridor. When I asked her gently why she hadn't come to call me, the police, the very first time she had been raped by one of these men, she simply put her hands over her face and wept. This is their way. They've always done this to the woman, and if you had got the police involved, they would have come back and beaten or killed me. The men then move on, having no more to do with the babies they have sired, nor contributing anything in the way of child support, to the next woman to start the same abuse over again. They could father up to 5 babies with each woman, with absolutely no responsibility towards their illegitimate offspring. The African languages were never written down until the missionaries arrived and began by translating the Bible from English to the various tribal languages so that they could convert them to Christianity. Traditionally, everything is passed down by word of mouth and is how the generations learn from their elders. The population has fragmented, with the majority of Africans moving away from their traditional rural villages and kraals and into the outskirts of the towns and cities. There are no longer tribal families per se, where a prospective husband would have to pay a formal visit to his prospective bride's father to pay lobola, marry her in a ceremony, and then take her home with him to his own kraal before having any carnal relationship with her. Now there are informal relationships between men and women, which results in the men fathering children with a girlfriend and then leaving them alone with several children to raise, to move on and impregnate the next woman. The outcome is that so many single mothers are left to struggle, and unless they have relatives with whom they can leave their children, cannot go and find work to earn money to feed them. My grandpa, Alan Ross, had accumulated 10 Zulu men with help from the missionaries, all refugees from the despotic, murderous Zulu chiefs in their own territories. The missionaries advised them to use the men who had been in Durban the longest, simply because they were accustomed to wearing clothing and could handle horses, something else they had never seen in their lives before. They had also become familiar with wagons and the wheels so foreign to them. While he had been recruiting, Grandpa had been to his father-in-law, W.G. Brown's massive warehouse, and brought plenty of blankets, overalls, gumboots, warm jerseys, woolen hats, and 3-legged iron pots, all at wholesale prices, along with all the other accoutrements necessary to make the men comfortable once they arrived in the alien territory where the farm lies. Being 6,000 feet above sea level, we had fairly brisk winters, albeit only about 3 months long. Mornings started with thick white frosts and -degrees temperatures, but as the sun rises, it warms everything up so quickly that by 10 a.m. in the morning, we could run around the farm barefoot, just wearing t-shirts and shorts. Once the sun had set beyond the mountains behind us, temperatures plummeted again, and we sit around a big roaring log fire in the evenings. We also have heavy snows every winter, and as both Grandpa and Dad kept daily records of every drop of rain and all the other weather conditions, all their working lives, They could see that snow could fall on the top of the plateau, we called Up on Top, in every month of the year. We spent many a Christmas Eve sitting around the big fireplace warming ourselves, although it was African midsummer in December. Grandpa had also bought himself 3 really good horses to take back to the farm to join the 2 Basotho ponies he already owned. With his gifted ear for music, he had found it fairly easy to learn the Zulu language at his other farm, Beverly, where there were already a few herdsmen established and working the stock. A neighbouring Boer farmer had gone bankrupt and decided to join his people in the Orange Free State. Grandpa had offered to take on his 3 Zulu herdsmen to run his much smaller farm and relatively small herd at Beverly. Zulu was a very simple language at the time because there were no words for basic items like spoons, fork, plates, horses, wheels, and so on. All those words which found their way into the Zulu language have been adapted from either English or Afrikaans. For instance, the words shovel and spade were lumped together to become a foshel. A fork was now a folok, and a lavatory was the aitoleti. He and the men had to make it up as they went along, and they still use these words now. The Roman Catholics were amalomeni, rather than like the Chinese and Japanese. They had never mastered the letter R, so we became amalozi, the Rosses. Also, there was no abstract terms like remorse, pity, sorry, or worry. He set off home on his wagon, which was laden with Zulu men, all the provisions they would need, and the horses walked behind, tethered to the wagon. Once home, since it was midsummer and fairly temperate, he set his new staff to building their own huts, so they had somewhere to live. He said it was a bit of a shambles, as the men had never done anything like this before. It had always been the women who had built the huts and done all the work. He also had to appoint a chief, because it was the only way to get them to do anything successfully. They had always lived a passive life, apart from breeding and fighting, and activities now had to be given by instruction by a senior tribesman, the Induna, the head man. Democracy is a completely foreign concept to Zulus. No man could give another man or of his equal instructions, as it would end up in some sort of argument or even a fight. There had to be a chief appointed by the most senior of them all, my grandfather, and everybody had to follow his instructions without question. Like most tribal people, it's only a dictatorship that works, be it a cruel, corrupt, and despotic one or not. In Zulu tradition, becoming the new chief was inevitably a gory procedure. The current chief would have to surround himself with his own henchmen, men he could trust, and try to keep them loyal by giving them gifts and favours denied to the others. This is why bribery or corruption, as we see it, is considered completely normal in African culture. It's always been so. Cattle, their currency, was used as a gift or a threat by having them taken away. If a man wanted a favour from his chief, he had to offer him as many cattle as it took, so as to have it granted. Sometimes men were punished by having their cattle removed and then given to a rival as a form of manipulation. Punishment by death was the chief's other way of keeping order. If he suspected a plot to overthrow his position, he'd have 1 or 2 of his henchmen murdered by the other bodyguards, as an example. After the missionaries brought in materials, goods like beads, copper, and other such sought-after trinkets, again, these were used as leverage for favours or punishment. The ANC government is simply continuing this practice, but using taxpayers' money to feather their own nests. Nepotism, as we know, is another way of granting favours, or even keeping enemies sweet by giving them prime jobs, however unsuited they are to the task, and access to vast sums of money to which they can help themselves with impunity. But since there is no such thing as loyalty, nor is there a word for it, there would always be plenty of greedy eyes looking at the chief's position. As he got older, his tenure became more and more fragile, and the day would come when one of his own trusted bodyguards, ran an assegai through his heart and claimed the chiefdom for himself. Even in the other larger primates, where the alpha male becomes old and frail, younger males will challenge him and they fight, but not to the death. The defeated older chimp, baboon, or gorilla limps away to become an outcast, living on his own periphery of the troop. In Zulu tradition, the old chief has to be murdered and his throne seized from him. Life is cheap and disposable amongst the Africans, and I will illustrate this later on. Now the new chief ruled, but always at the back of his mind with the fear that exactly the same thing would happen to him, sooner or later. The more despotic, cruel, vindictive, and dangerous a chief was, the longer he stayed in power. So his rule demanded that he instilled complete fear rather than respect from his people. The best example was Shaka. His half-brothers Dingaan and Mpande assassinated him and took his throne for themselves. Effectively, the same thing happened to Mandela in the last stage of his presidency. His ANC cadres began mocking him and calling him a useless old man who knows nothing. He had served his purpose, and the next thing to do was to get rid of him and seize his position for themselves. The liberal West, who keeps imposing democracy on tribal countries, simply have no idea what they're doing. In the 1994 election in South Africa, the voting system was a total farce, a charade, with pictures of various animals representing each party, and offered to the illiterate black public to choose a leader for themselves. They had no idea who they were voting for, and the ANC took advantage of this. Well beforehand, they shipped bus and lorry loads of Africans from all over the country, having rounded them up in rural places like the Transkei, offering them promises that they would be rewarded with every white man's house, cars, and money, which they had coveted for so long, but only if they voted for the ANC. They deliberately drove these people to any vacant land surrounding white towns, dropped them off with poles and corrugated iron so they could build themselves shacks, and then went off to collect more. Squatter camps suddenly bloomed out of nowhere on the edges of places like Knysna, Plettenberg Bay, where I was spending some time, George, and all down the beautiful garden route. I saw it happening with my own eyes. Buses crammed with excited, shrieking Africans, Xhosas in this case, arriving from all over, dumping them off and then going back for more. This was happening all over the country. Of course, the building materials were far too scarce and there wasn't enough for more than a handful of people. So these unsuspecting potential voters had to build themselves shelters from cardboard, road signs, purloin from the N2 in this case, Coca-Cola signs, and anything else they could get their hands on. There's no thatching grass, only fynbos in that area, so they had no roofing material either, and used black plastic bags to try and keep some of the rain out. It was hard not to feel sorry for them, but we were far more worried about the consequences we whites would suffer once the ANC had won the election. Fortunately for us at the time, they were empty promises, and the people remained there, the squatter camps getting bigger every day, sprawling around every white town like a sinister black cloak. They had nothing in the way of possessions nor proper shelter, and no way of earning any money, as our small white population simply could not employ them. So as a result, crime in those previously safe and sleepy seaside towns rocketed through the roof, and we found ourselves besieged behind high walls, razor wire, and electric fences. A lot of the black population became bos slapers, homeless people who lived in the bushes amongst the sand dunes, and mugged residents and tourists alike as they went to and from the beaches. They repeatedly broke into all the parked cars as well as our homes and shops. Every bus full of tourists that arrived in the main streets found themselves with hundreds of black AIDS orphans, homeless children who sniffed glue, and then pestered everyone, including us, whenever we wanted to go and get our post or buy groceries. By swarming over our cars and the buses, tugging on their sleeves and clamouring for money for food, startled Europeans like Germans, the Dutch and other Europeans handed out money left, right and centre, compounding the problem for the rest of us. after they had left. The nationalist government had built orphanages especially for these children, but they didn't like the basic discipline that was imposed upon them, preferring to run away to beg for money to sniff glue. The police used to round them up at the beginning of the main tourist season and return them to the orphanages, but they were soon back on the streets again. There was plenty of faction fighting too, particularly in Natal, where we, who were living in the suburbs, could clearly hear gunfire and explosions, probably from Molotov cocktails being thrown at people's shacks coming from the township. The opposition to the ANC, the Inkatha Freedom Party, or IFP, led by Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who had founded the party in 1975, is almost entirely consisted of Zulus, sworn enemies of the Xhosa tribes. All over the country, but especially in Natal, these two warring tribes fought each other to the death, and thousands of people, including women and children, caught in the crossfire, were murdered. In Pietermaritzburg, the capital city, eventually the nationalist government army was forced to call in 32 Battalion, that famous crack unit consisting of mainly Kalahari tribesmen who had fought so ferociously against the Angolan communists on our border. I will never forget that morning in the city of Pietermaritzburg, where I had a business selling architectural supplies. A faint rumbling started. The city went absolutely quiet as traffic was rerouted from the main street, and we all stood outside on the pavement and watched as the rumbling grew louder and louder. Then came the endless convoy of sand-coloured armoured troop carriers, nose to tail, all manned by these slightly yellowish, high-cheeked Africans who stared dead ahead, looking neither left nor right, their faces totally expressionless. This massive convoy moved past the city hall for over an hour and seemed to be endless. There were so many of them. They had been called in to ring-fence the townships, so the fighting didn't spill over into the white suburbs or the city. Typically, the young white woman I had as a sales clerk, who had been harping on about the plight of the poor Africans, how apartheid was so cruel, it was such a good thing the country was going to be given back to the original inhabitants, the black people, and was going to vote for the ANC, ran back inside my office and hid behind the desk, crying. She was under the impression that we were being invaded by the townships and was imploring me, a right-wing racist, to rescue her. The other problem with the African voting is that they voted for the person they most want to be, rather than someone who may be good for their welfare. A prime example is Winnie Mandela. She had the votes of almost all the African women in South Africa, who consist of 50% of the population. They wanted to be like her, rich, powerful, and best of all, feared. Democracy had failed all over Africa, and also in Iraq and Afghanistan, to name but a few countries in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein was a cruel despot, but he kept a firm lid on all the infighting that would have gone on without him, and subsequently it became another failed state after he was deposed by the West. Grandpa appointed his original senior man, Ngidi, as the new Induna. Once the basics of the kraal was ready, Grandpa sent Ngidi back to Durban with his ox wagon and the new men, so those who wanted or dared to could make arrangements to get messages back to their wives and children so that they could be brought back to join the men. He wanted stability in his new kraal, and a group of single men gets nothing done. They need their women to get on with their day-to-day living, freeing them up to herd the stock. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. When Dad's parents moved across from their ranch, Beverly, in the Dargle, about 15 miles away, Grandpa's Induna at Beverly was a man called Ngidi, and naturally he came across to New Forest with his wives and children, including Robert, who was 10 at the time, the same age as Dad. When Dad was born in 1915, Ngidi's wife produced a son that same year. The two boys became very close, lifelong friends and playmates. There was none of the peculiar snobbery that made Mum insist that we girls never play with the Munt children, which I totally ignored because she never followed it up. Dad and Robert spent all their time together until Dad went to boarding school at King's School in Nottingham Road, and then a couple of years later on to Michael House at Balgarn, about 30 miles away from the farm. Now, Michael House is a school that I went to, and what a magnificent school. But anyway. They continued to play together during their school holidays, though, although Robert must have gone back to Impengele at some stage during these years, as he had had some schooling, was able to read and write, and thus pass his driving test in Moy River. After the Second World War, when Dad came home to live at New Forest with his new bride, Ngidi, Senior, retired. Robert took his place as the Induna on the farm, and like Mum and Dad, he produced 4 daughters. He never had a son, just these 4 girls. Of course, Robert was delighted as each new girl arrived, as it meant he would receive many head of good cattle as lobola, and each birth was a cause for rejoicing. Rather the opposite of what was happening in the big farmhouse 500 yards away, where Mum and Dad received the news of the gender of each of their children with such dismay, because they were all girls. Robert had his own hut, bigger than any of the others, except for Ufutu Kea, the dormitory accommodation for bachelor farm labourers, which was a long, oblong, thatched hut with several doors. His hut was round, like the others, but bigger. His wife kept a hock with some fowls and had a flourishing veggie patch, growing pumpkins, sorghum, potatoes, and mealies. Because Zulus are not farmers and have no ideas how to grow crops successfully, my grandmother had to teach Ngidi's wife how to reuse a growing area. As I explained in my previous piece, the woman scratched out some earth and planted mealies. Every season they had to create a new plot, as the soil was now exhausted, and or the tribe had moved on to other hunting grounds. Grandma taught her how to add well-rotted cow or horse manure and add a little wood ash as fertilizer, then work it into the soil until it was well mixed. That way she could reuse the same bit of land over and over again. She also provided seed, potatoes, cabbage and Swiss chard, spinach seedlings, pumpkin seeds, and introduced many other fruit and vegetables to Mrs. Ngidi, showing her how to plant them so as to vary their diet. The kraal had running water in the form of a standpipe feed from the spring in the hill, just behind. All our own water came from the same spring and was pure, almost sweet, crystal clear water filtered by plenty of moss. To this day I still can't stand drinking tap water, as to me it tastes of lavatories. Ngidi's most senior wife lived with him, but none of his daughters. They lived with the rest of his wives in Impengele and had some sort of schooling, as Robert earned a better salary and the best of our Zulus, being in charge of all of them. The hierarchy went upwards from him to the white manager, whose wife was supposed to be our governess, and then to Dad, who had to finally settle disputes or make some of the most crucial decisions. All the farm staff liked and respected Robert Ngidi immensely, and he was a valuable asset to the smooth running of the farm. When he gained his driving license, Dad had an immaculate white chauffeur's coat and white cap, like yachtsmen wear, with a shiny black peak sent up to him from W.G. Brown's to wear on special occasions. Otherwise, he drove our old war-issue American Willys Jeep and trailer all over the farm, wearing faded denim bib overalls. When for a year all 4 of us were at St. Anne's Prep and College, respectively at Hilton Road, at the beginning and end of the 4 terms, Robert would drive our enormous black 1967 Pontiac, back seat and boot filled with our 4 school trunks, over the day before. So there would be enough room for Mum and the 4 of us, plus our own small overnight cases in the car the following day when she fetched us herself. Dad had chosen this ridiculous vehicle, so terribly unsuited to our roads, which skidded and slid over all the appallingly bad potholed red mud road that we had to negotiate for 20 miles before reaching any tarmac at Nottingham Road. In the summer, the wet season, we'd invariably get stuck in the slick, gluttonous mud, and dressed in our smart school uniforms would have to get out and push while Mum swore, shouted at us and tried to wrestle this beast back into momentum. We'd arrive at school covered in red mud from our shoes to our hair. When he bought it, Dad had in mind that this was the biggest vehicle he could find in which to fit the 6 of us comfortably. He had overlooked the fact that this American-made massive tennis court on wheels with its soft, spongy suspension, which rocked on for some time after it had come to a standstill, wasn't the sort of vehicle designed for our roads. He had hardly ever drove it anyway, as he had a Land Rover pickup, which he had room for only 2 adults in the front. When the time came for us to get married, Robert proudly drove Dad and each bride to the Nottingham Road church, the car beribboned with white satin, and Robert proudly at the wheel in his smart chauffeur's uniform. He beamed back at the waving crowds of Zulus who screamed, "Makoti," or bride, as the car sailed by, his broad smile revealing about half a dozen rickety-looking teeth higgledy-piggledy in his shining pink gums. From infancy, I loved Robert and followed him around all day, helping burn fire breaks, dipping cattle, rounding up stock, and getting involved in everything that was happening on the farm. I must have been a terrible nuisance because, just for one example, one day at the age of 6, when I was setting a fire break, I got tangled up in barbed wire fences, and all the felt around me was 6 feet high and roaring flames. I could see no escape, so I screamed for help, and it was patient old Robert who came stamping through the fire in his gumboots to lift me carefully out of the barbs and set me down on a rock, safely away from the fire, while he went back to retrieve the pot and my mealie cob on its wire, the equipment I was using to set the fire line. When we girls had married and left home, and time came for Robert and Gidi to retire, he left the farm to live out his days in his hut in his kraal in Impensley. He had plenty of wives to look after him, and no shortage of daughters either to do the same. As he did with all his pensioners, Dad gave him a generous lifetime supply of money, as well as sending our farm manager up to Impensley each month, the Land Rover laden with a big sack of mealie meal, some meat, and any other clothing or other items we no longer wore or needed. Robert received all this until the day he died in old age. As he and his wife could live for almost nothing on the farm because there was such an abundance of food, blankets, gumboots and overalls, and because he had received a good salary as induna, practically all his money was intact. So Robert had been able to pay for his daughters to have an education, and they became teachers, nurses and clerks. They in turn were able to support their parents in a comfortable retirement. Robert had a tribal name, and Gidi was his surname, but I never knew it. As children, as a sign of respect, those of our staff who had a Christian name as well as their tribal names, we were expected to call them by their Christian names, so we addressed him as Lobeti, a version of Robert. If we ever dared to call him Gidi, we'd get a scolding from him or any other members of staff, including our nannies. So we had Ben, Masango, as a cook, Makaya, who was never given a Christian name, so we called him by his tribal name, Makaya. My nanny was Evelina, and even though she looked after me for 12 years, almost round the clock, I never knew her tribal name, only her surname, Indlovu, meaning elephant. I saw very little of my own mother. Our parents really wanted boys, on the basis of a rather Victorian view that only a son would be entitled to inherit the ranch and continue the line of wealthy gentleman farmers like my father, who had inherited the ranch from his parents. The last straw for our parents was when another girl arrived after me, the third, and they threw in the towel and gave up trying for a boy altogether. As each daughter was born, our mother immediately lost interest, handed us over to be raised by Zulu nannies, and turned back to her real passion, which was gardening. It fell to us that every day since we'd been born, we girls were subjected to a genuinely heartfelt lament. If only you had been boys, our lives would have been so much easier. We were just too big a disappointment for her to bear. Mum was a perfectionist with a volatile temper, and we were all scared of her, just as we had been terrified of Dad, who disliked children in general and girls in particular. Just before the Second World War, Dad had spent 3 years at Cambridge College in England, completing an agricultural degree, and constantly bemoaned the travesty that had allowed women into Cambridge after he had left. Thus the Zulus became an integral part of me and my sister's lives. From infancy, we were absorbed into the lives in the house and the farm staff. Our upbringing was haphazard. Speaking pure Zulu, we learned all the ways of our local African tribe, their folklore, beliefs, superstitions, and many other traditions, as well as their skills of tracking game and the use of indigenous plants in witchcraft and healing. Since none of the staff spoke any English, Zulu was the only language we used on the farm. We 4 girls had 2 nannies to look after us, and on the very few occasions our parents spoke directly to us, they used a combination of a little bit of English but mostly Zulu, as those rare interactions were usually the form of instructions to be passed on to our nannies. To me, Evelina was old, but I think she must have been only about 25 when she became my nanny. Traditionally, Zulu maidens became brides at the ages of 14 or 15, normally in exchange for cattle as lobola, and bore their first children soon afterwards. So Evelina could have had anything of up to 5 children on her own back in Mpenjle, being cared for by her own mother. Infant mortality was high in those days, but the Roman Catholic nuns never gave out prophylactics, of course, so the birth rate was higher. This, as we know, became a massive problem, particularly when the apartheid nationalist government provided inoculations and medical attention in the way of particularly well-run hospitals and clinics for Africans all over the country. Evelina's age was difficult to determine. She was illiterate, as were all our staff, and Zulus, in those times anyway. It didn't register the births of their children. The villages are too remote for a new delivered mother to trudge over 40 miles of mountainous and sometimes leopard-inhabited country to the closest municipal registry. Our nearest was in Lions River, about 50 miles away. Burdened down by her previous baby, now a year old, strapped to her back in a shawl, her newborn infant in her arms, and often, if she didn't have a relative to leave them with, had the other very small children in tow. The mother might even already be pregnant with her next baby, as the only form of population control amongst rural Zulus was a very high infant mortality rate. Anyway, the Africans didn't see the point of this, umlungu, number keeping. They knew who was in their tribe. And as they did with their cattle, instead of by counting, which they couldn't do unless they'd been taught at a mission school, they knew them by sight and by name. As an old age pension was issued to all natives over the age of 60, the recipient had to produce some kind of physical identification to receive it. There was the official system whereby every month the pensioner would be taken by their relatives to Lions River, often in a wheelbarrow, on a journey taking several days, and Faga Utupi, their pension book, placed an ink-bed thumbprint over an X instead of a signature to collect their allowance of a few pounds sterling. Wily older relatives over their late 30s would cut off the right thumb of their parents' corpse before they performed the 3-day burial ceremony, pickle the thumb in mess, and by secreting the legitimate digit under their own, kept drawing pensions for their long-deceased elders for years, as it was difficult to determine the age of a Zulu. They don't wrinkle or lose their hair, and only some of them turn a little grey at the temples. The logistics of the Afrikaner government officials keeping track of the numbers of births and deaths, those weren't registered either, on natives, their collective word for Africans, although we, the Afrikaner clerks, were all born in South Africa as well, in the rural areas were too much to overcome. The Afrikaner officials would become suspicious and do some investigations only when some of those older Zulus reached ages that surpassed any of those in the Guinness Book of Records. Jamela, our herdsman in charge of all the sheep, was old because his thinning curls were grizzled white at the temples, like Robert's and Micaiah's, and he had lost most of his teeth. Like Micaiah and Lokatia, he didn't have a Christian name, and he lived in his own little kraal of huts, wives and children up on the top of the farm, and looked after the 5,000 head of sheep that grazed on the veldt up there all year round, except when there was a forecast of heavy snow in the winter, when Dad sent a message via one of the other herdsmen to bring him down into the valley, where the bush afforded them good shelter and grazing. Evelina loved me as I were one of her own children, and I loved her too, but my mother's rules were very strictly enforced, and Evelina was terrified of Mum, and the fact that she could be fired on the spot and replaced with any of the other Zulu women who worked on the farm. I would sit still or play games with my much younger sister's dolls, so Evelina turned a blind eye to my slipping away, and then spent the whole day worrying she'd lose her job for the rest of the time. It never occurred to me that my disobedience might have preyed on her mind, that her job might be hanging by a thread. Fortunately for me and my nanny, my mother was too engrossed in her gardening to check on me, and for the first 12 years she never knew what I was up to. If there was any need for me to be called back to the house, Evelina left my youngest sister with Lisha, the other nanny, and came to look for me, calling in that special hilltop calling voice all the Zulus use to communicate over long distances. Her voice carried along the valley and bounced off the mountainsides, and I was able to sense by the urgency and the tone of her cries to hurry and meet her. I didn't want either of us to get into trouble. So there you go. The next piece that Fiona is sending is about witch doctors and more insights into the manners, traditions, beliefs and superstitions of the Zulu people. I find these pieces particularly interesting because they give you an insight into the psyche of the Zulu people. And really what they basically spell out is why they're incapable of running municipalities or organizations that really require a very high level of competence. Alright guys, please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Ring the bell for the updates. Please like this video, please share this video, and above all, please stay safe. Bye.